Topic 8.7 Global Resistance to Established Power Structures. And this is after 1900 as well. Okay. So, central question for today is what were the different responses to existing power structures after 1900? So, from the curriculum, although conflicts dominated much of the 20th century, many individuals, groups, including states, opposed this trend. Some individuals and groups, however, intensified the conflicts. So, today we're going to talk about some of the examples of those who are challenging power structures and as well as ones who are really using their power to hold on to power structures too. So let's talk about some of the global power structures that are going to be intensify or lead to intensified conflicts in response to the challenge to those structures. So, a country in South America, Chile, we haven't really talked about much in recent lectures, but they are going to end up coming under the control of Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet is going to come to power in a military coup and gets rid of the democratically elected government. In years past, we talked mostly about him in response to the idea of, and we probably will in Unit 9, about his responding to socialism in a way where he's trying to push back and promote more free markets systems and so forth. But in this case, as far as his pushback against resistance to power structure that he had established, where he is pretty much the dictator of Chile, is that he uses his military to go after his political opponents. And for him, those were socialists and people who were more on the left side of the political spectrum. He was generally backed by the United States for most of the time that he becomes the dictator, largely because it goes back to the Cold War aspect where we're trying to stop the spread of communism. And so if he can get rid of leftists in his country, that was for the benefit of the United States at that time. But of course, he is going to be violating lots of people's human rights in doing so. And so that's something that occurs on. And thousands of people will die in jail as they're rounded up and arrested and pretty much shut down as far as any political opposition to his authority. The next one is Francisco Franco of Spain. And you guys hopefully remember reading about this in, I think, chapter 21. And Franco comes to power in 1939. He is a fascist. Even though he is a fascist, Spain does pretty much stay out of the war. But there is going to be a civil war from, I think it's 1936 to 1939, and it is between two factions within Spain, the fascists and the communists. And both those sides are going to fight a war that is pretty bloody. It's almost like a prelude to the Second World War, as far as terrible tactics of bombing civilians and some of the new weaponry that gets ended up being used. And then at the same time, it's between communism and fascism, which you see on the Eastern Front in World War II. But the Civil War itself, once it's won by Franco, he will rule Spain with an iron fist. And again, just like Pinochet, he is going to oppress a lot of the political opponents and dissenters to his rule. And so he would use his military as a bona fide police force to round up any political opponents, anybody who spoke out against any decision that was made by Franco. Again, he rules with an iron fist, and somewhere between 60 to 400,000 people would be executed under his rule. And I know that some of you are thinking that's a pretty wide range, but again, a lot of these executions and the people they're rounding up was not documented. And if it was, it might have been destroyed, as his government will eventually crumble against pressure from internal groups and so forth. But yes, Franco, another example of kind of pushing back against challenges to the established political structures, the ones that he's in charge of there. All right, the next one is Uganda under Idi Amin. Amin is going to come into power in 1971 through a coup d'etat. He was a military general that declares himself to be the president of Uganda. And he is going to first align himself with the Western powers, the United States and the UK. And over time, when he wasn't getting the things that he wanted from them, he switches sides and he starts aligning himself along with the Soviet Union. And that's something that was not very well liked. But in Africa, the by the time he's in power, the Cold War is starting to ease up a little bit, and so they weren't as focused and concerned about some of the political days, and the United States government wasn't as concerned about the political instability that was going on in Africa at that time. So, as time goes on, he does try to invade Tanzania. He tries to annex parts of Tanzania. Julius Nyerere, who we talked about in our previous lecture in 8.6, he is going to resist and fight against. He sends troops to stop the invasion, and they will have a war that neither side comes out benefiting from in the end. Min was also a economically incompetent leader. He had no idea how to successfully manage his economy, and that became a disaster. And then when he didn't have any real solutions for that, they began to blame people within the country for the problems that exist. So he started targeting ethnic groups, political opponents for the problems of their country, and somewhere between 100 to 500,000 people would then be killed, jailed, persecuted, and so forth during his rule. So again, another example of somebody, as soon as he had some pushback against his rule, he clamps down with an iron fist and tends to make things worse in terms of human cost and human rights violations. Another example of the pushback against the established power structures and such was the building up of the military industrial complex in the United States and the Soviets. When people challenged these two superpowers in some way, their general way of pushing back was that they continued to build up their arms so that they could keep each other in balance or try to win the balance of power between the two. It also would lead to them selling great deals of weapons. Both sides, both superpowers, were the biggest arms dealers during World War II. The United States still today is the biggest arms dealers in the world. And the United States is going to continue to fund and support and arm people that we want to be associated with us, and try to keep control of the spheres of influences in different parts of the world. And the Soviets will do the same. So the economy of the United States is very much built into. Hi. So my coworkers decided to join us, and we know where I left off, but the both sides will try to use their military strength. And as I was saying before, now I remember, the economy of the United States is very much built into how much weapons we do produce. A lot of jobs are created. Bases were opened up. Those bases then become integral parts of communities, economies, and so forth. So after the Cold War ends, it was very hard to kind of pull that back in because we didn't need the amount of weapons. And so there was an economic transition. But even today, like you talk about closing a base in the United States, you can bet that there's going to be some pushback by the representatives of those communities, of those districts, because it does affect them very much so economically. All right. So now we're going to kind of move on to groups and individuals that challenged the many wars of the century. And in some of them, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. And big point is they all promoted the practice of nonviolence as a way to bring about political change. So they're challenging political structures in existence, but doing so in nonviolent means. Okay. So we talked about Gandhi a lot already in some of these lectures that we've been doing the last week and a half or so. And if you recall, Gandhi used boycotts, he used protests, marches, all of which were through nonviolent means. Violence did happen, but it was not something he promoted, and it's not something that became wide scale in India as they were pushing for independence, eventually forcing the British to come to the negotiation table and give them independence where they can have their own constitution and so forth. You guys recall, hopefully, from 7.5, one of the big tactics that not tactics, but one of the big events during this whole movement was the Salt March. And you can see Gandhi here coming and picking up salt. And remember that salt was under the control of the British. And so this was his way of saying, we don't need the British to tell us that we have to buy salt through them. It's right here. We're just going to come here and we're going to get it. And of course, he gets arrested and it's okay with the consequences. It brings more attention to his movement, and more Indians began to take part in these nonviolent demonstrations across the country. All right, Martin Luther King Jr. If you haven't heard of Martin Luther King Jr. at this point in time, I'm really surprised by that. But Martin Luther King Jr., he is definitely part of the curriculum for United States history as well. But as far as world history, he's another example of a world leader who's challenging existing power structures in a nonviolent way. And so the power structure he's challenging is the segregation laws that were found in the United States, particularly in the southern United States, known as Jim Crow laws. And these laws made it illegal for whites and blacks to be able to use things like restaurant, or be in the similar restaurants, or be in using the same bathrooms or something along those lines. And they had designated public areas for people who are white and people who are people of color. And that's just how it was from the end of the Civil War, in most cases in the South, till the 1960s and even to the 1970s, where even though court cases and civil rights laws have been passed to end this, it took acts of courts basically telling state and local officials, you must comply. But regardless, that's what the power structure he's challenging. Again, he's doing it in a nonviolent way. So some of the examples in which he does this, Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister. He was educated at Boston University, very highly intelligent, very good speaker and writer. But when he became the head of this movement, it was not something he went out and seek to do. It's just something that not necessarily fell to his lap, but there was an opportunity for him to do something, and he used his power of influence, being the minister of a community in Montgomery, Alabama. He helps organize a boycott against the bus system. And so for those of you who know the story about this a little bit, Rosa Parks, who is a woman who ends up basically refusing, because during the days of segregation, the public bus systems, people who were black needed to move to the back of the bus. And if a person who was white asked for the seat, they had to give it up. That was not necessarily just the custom, but the law. And she refused to do so. And so she gets herself arrested. It brings attention to it. And he and other leaders within the Montgomery community, which he kind of becomes the head of this whole movement, end up organizing a boycott to where the African-American community would no longer use the public buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And that was a major problem, because the people of Montgomery, Alabama, the ones who were African-Americans, used that bus to get to work. And so without them using it, the bus system and such, it would go bankrupt. And they knew the power of their economic strength if they all worked together to bring about this change. And their churches organized to where they can get members of the community who had cars to be able to pick people up, take them to work. The churches themselves even pulled the resources together and bought a few cars themselves to make sure that the boycott would stand, so that people can still get their jobs, make their money, and so forth. And then after a year of this, the Montgomery bus system basically said, all right, we give up. You guys can ride wherever you want. We'll change the rules. You do not have to give your seat up to a person who is white. And so that was successful. The March on Washington was kind of the apex of his movement, where millions of people showed up in Washington, D.C. This is where he gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. And if you haven't heard that speech or read that speech, highly suggest it to you, as well as the letter from Birmingham jail, which comes, I should have put the letter of Birmingham jail after or before the March on Washington. This was in 1964. Birmingham jail was 1963. But this movement, these aren't the only things that he was part of, and he wasn't the only leader of the civil rights movement. I can't stress that enough. But he is the one, it's one of the more prominent, more famous of the people who are part of the civil rights movement. And even there's a reason why today we do celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. holiday every January. February. But anyway, moving on, the next person is Nelson Mandela of South Africa. And so Nelson Mandela was a socialist lawyer who's going to challenge the power structure of South Africa, which was essentially a racially segregated system known as the apartheid. So in South Africa's history, they had a lot of white settlers settle into South Africa, and they became known as the Afrikaners. And so they saw South Africa as their home, but they were still in the minority comparatively to South Africans who were African of descent, so black. And even though they were the minority, they had organized the government to benefit the whites more than the blacks. And so this racially segregation system, the system that they had created in the apartheid, made sure that whites had all the economic, political, and social advantages in South Africa, despite being the minority group in terms of population numbers. So, of course, over time, there's lots of pushback for this, but more and more anger is going to happen as a result of this apartheid. And Nelson Mandela was part of a movement that did try to use violent means to end the apartheid, and that has something that he happened when he was very young. He ends up ending his stance on violence later on. He is thrown in jail for bombing. Or being part of a bombing. And while in jail, he kind of starts to get more on board with the idea of a nonviolent movement. And so him, and I would say even more so as far as the nonviolent movement, a Catholic priest named Desmond Tutu, they are both going to push for change through nonviolent means. And so they organize boycotts. And then remember, the people in South Africa, the majority are black, and they have economic power. So they start organizing boycotts against white stores and things like that. And, economically, that's crushing to them. On top of that, they reach out to international community and such and say, hey, if you support South Africa, you support this system. And so, a lot of corporations who did business in South Africa basically said, we're not going to do any more business with you in South Africa. We're not going to buy from you. We're not going to sell to you until you change the system. So that pressure from international communities, that was probably the nail in the coffin for the apartheid system. And eventually they do decide to get rid of it. But Nelson Mandela is a leader of that movement, and notable in that sense that he does, not at first, but eventually accept the idea of nonviolent resistance as a means to challenge the power structures, in this case, the apartheid. So worth mentioning there. And then Nelson Mandela ends up becoming, after the apartheid is ended and the new constitution is created, and of course, Africans in South Africa were given the right to vote democratically. They elect him to be their first president. So a very important person in history for lots of reasons, but definitely know about his being part of the nonviolent movement. So some other ones that are not in the curriculum anymore, but I do want to mention, we talked about the non-alignment movement. We talked about the anti-apartheid movement that Nelson Mandela was a leader of. There was also a global protest in 1968 across the world and such. There were protests in Poland against the communist puppet government. Same with in Czechoslovakia. There was stuff that was going on in terms of protests against the power structures of the communist governments in Eastern Europe. Spain, there's challenges to Franco's authority. And so in 1968, there was a lot of global protests around the world. Even the United States was dealing with a lot, and a lot of them tied around with the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam protests. 1960, I had a teacher who used to tell me that if we can survive 1968, we can survive anything as a country. So I know things seem pretty bad now, but in 1968, they probably were a lot grimmer at this point in time in the year. So Tiananmen Square is another example of challenge to political authority. And Tiananmen Square happened in, I think it was 1984? 1985. But 70 years after the May 4th protest, the Tiananmen Square itself was a protest to try to gain more political and economic freedoms. When the communist government, who had at that time started to ease restrictions on the command economy and allowing more free market stuff a little bit during the 1980s. Tiananmen Square, was kind of more, the people there wanted to get more and more freedoms and such. So they started staging protests, and those protests went over the course of days, weeks, and then a month. The Chinese government itself did not listen to the protesters. They kept telling them to leave. Eventually, they decided to send soldiers in. And so this famous photo and such that you can see this man, he's known as the Tank Man. Basically, right behind him would be this column of tanks. And he just walks out into the street, and they're all heading towards the Tiananmen Square to break up the protests. And he stands in front of the tank, and he just basically puts his arms up and he's like, nope, you can't go anywhere. And they try to go around him, and then he just kind of sidesteps to block him again. Eventually, someone grabs him and moves him out of the way because they might have just hit the gas and just ran him over if they hadn't. But that symbol of, and that picture becomes a symbol of the, how do I put this, of the one person, challenging the authority of the state in China, and still is a worldwide recognized photograph today. Unless you're in China, because they don't really talk about the Tiananmen Square, because they end up executing maybe 2,000 to 5,000 people in breaking up that protest, sadly. All right, so moving on back to the curriculum. Military and militarized states often responded to the proliferation of conflicts in ways that further intensified conflict. And there's lots of examples that you can say here, but I'm only going to give you one, and that is the United States and Vietnam. And so when the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese are challenging the structure of the South and trying to, especially internal guerrillas, the communist guerrillas known as the Viet Cong. The United States is going to send in more soldiers into Vietnam to try to stop that from happening. And then it slowly builds up and intensifies, through the late 1960s and early 1970s, up until 1973 when the United States agrees to pull out. So I talked a lot about Vietnam War in a previous lecture, so I'm not going to get too much detail here. Some movements, sorry, that's my phone. Some movements use violence against civilians to achieve political aims. And I'm sure a lot of you recognize this picture here. We're going to talk a little bit about 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. But before then, we're going to talk about the Shining Path. And this was a communist party in Peru that began in 1980. And so this communist party in Peru, the Shining Path, was way more extreme than you would find in a lot of places around the world. And one thing that they were very much, how do I put this? They were very much against the lack of success of China and the Soviet Union and their ability to spread communism and create what ultimately was something that communists were trying to achieve, was a global revolution of the people, of the working class people. And so they begin to engage in more violence against peasants, people who oppose their extreme views on communism and so forth. And so lots of violence occurred in Peru, during the 1980s in trying to spark this communist revolution and global revolution itself. So that's something that is relatively new to the curriculum, but it's basically another example of using violence against civilians to try to achieve goals. The one that also, where can I put myself here? Let's stay here. Okay. Another one and better examples, and one you should definitely know, is Al-Qaeda, who are going to try to use violence against civilians to achieve their political goals. So Al Qaeda is a terrorist organization led by a man named Osama bin Laden, and I forget that a lot of you are now kind of young and you don't remember. None of you were alive during this time when 9/11 happened, so you don't remember a lot of this stuff. But Osama bin Laden led an organization, Al Qaeda. He's a Saudi. He comes from a very wealthy, oil-rich family. He is the black sheep, though. They don't really have much ties to any ties to him now, especially that he's dead. But when he was younger, he went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan, which we'll talk about in 8.8. And he was actually considered an ally of the United States during that time because he was fighting against the Soviets. The United States are fighting against the Soviets. So they kind of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But after the Soviets were left Afghanistan and the Soviet Union broke up, he is going to look for ways to try to remove the influence and presence of the United States and its military in the Middle East. And the United States military was brought there not brought there, but they went there during the first Gulf War in 1990 when Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. And Saudi Arabia invited the United States to come and help defend their lands. And then at the same time, we worked to a strategy to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, which we did. But for Osama bin Laden, the presence of foreign soldiers, American soldiers in Saudi Arabia, the home to the holy lands of Islam, was not something that he saw as good. And so he wanted to try, his political goals was to try to remove the United States, and he tried using terrorism against civilians to try to achieve that. And so, he had committed several acts of terrorism prior to 9/11. He was responsible for the bombings of two U.S. embassies in Africa. An attack on a USS Cole, which was I believe a destroyer or a frigate of the United States Navy. They had a suicide boat ram it with a bunch of explosives and blew a big hole in it, killed some soldiers. So some of these attacks had already occurred, and then there was 9/11. And 9/11, they had organized where they were going to hijack some planes. They ended up hijacking 4 planes. Two of them ended up flying into the World Trade Center in New York City, which this was not just an attack on civilians, it's also an attack on the global economic stability, since it's the World Trade Center. This is the epicenter of organization of world trade around the world. It's like the symbol of globalization that is happening in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So his attack on that was, pretty devastating, not just in terms of lives, but of the economic impacts of it too. And of course, one attacks the Pentagon, which is, the headquarters of the United States military command. And then there was one that was shot down, or not shot down, but it went down because the people on the plane overpowered the hijackers, and it ended up crashing into a open field in Pennsylvania. But that was heading in the direction of Washington D.C., and many suspect that it was headed in the direction of the White House. So anyway, this attack itself was the largest attack on American soil in its history. Remember, Pearl Harbor was only a territory. Hawaii was a territory during World War II. So this was pretty devastating to American people who are not accustomed to suffering large casualties of war. And for this, for people who are part of Al Qaeda, this is a war for them, and it becomes a war for us. And so the United States is going to end up fighting the war on terror, to which we will invade Afghanistan to remove military bases that he had established for the purpose of training terrorists. Get rid of the Taliban regime that was supporting him in Afghanistan, which they have never been fully successful on. We're still in Afghanistan today. I mean, our involvement isn't as heavy as it used to be, but we still have a large military presence in Afghanistan still today. And of course, we invaded Iraq as part of that too, to remove Saddam Hussein. But that's another topic for another time. But another example of using violence against civilians to try to achieve political means. There's a couple others that I should mention. The ETA, which was in the Baptist Spain, they're challenging the authority of the Spanish government, and then the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which was created or 1910s to originally oppose the rule of the British, which Ireland was under the control of Britain. They end up gaining a form of independence. However, Ireland has still to this day not been reunited as a whole. Northern Ireland still under the control of the United Kingdom. And they have not ceased the control of that. But during the 1980s, the IRA, who was not friends with the Irish government. In fact, they fought a civil war right after they won their independence. But the Irish Republican Army is still around to some extent. They've disarmed mostly, but in the 1980s, they set off quite a few car bombs in Belfast, which is the capital of Northern Ireland. The goals of their organization is to try to reunite Ireland into one island again. So now Northern Ireland become part of Ireland itself. But the IRA again is generally they're in hibernation, I guess, but they're still there. They still have a very much political wing presence known as Sinn Féin in the Irish Parliament. In the most recent elections, they just gained more seats. So Brexit can probably be attributed to why they're gaining more popularity there. They may see an opportunity to try to reunite Ireland. All right. So this goes back to our essential question. What were the different responses to existing power structures after 1900? So make sure you answer it into the Canvas page. And then this one will not be due until the 10th of April. So that's next Wednesday if you're watching that today. So, which is Friday. I will see you all next time.